Hello, listeners. Welcome again to the IndiaAnya podcast. This is our second episode, and we have some very exciting conversations ahead on a topic that is so close to our hearts and to many of our writers, and especially to our panelists today. November is National Adoption Month, and November 9th is World Adoption Day. It is not a much talked about topic, but we are so glad for the changing tides and the progress we have made in starting these conversations, especially in Indian Christian circles. I am Sue, your host, along with Shobana, and we have Sarmishta, Sarah, and Karisa with us today. We've had the privilege of having them write for IndiaAnya on different topics, including adoption. All three of them are adoptive mothers, and we are very excited to talk to them about their journeys of adoption and their lovely children. Welcome, ladies. We are so glad to have you with us tonight. May I please ask you to introduce yourselves now and tell us a little bit about yourself and your adoption story? Sarmishra, would you like to get us started?
Sure. My name is Sarmishta Venkatesh. People call me Shami. My husband, Venkatesh, is the pastor of Anugraha Reform Presbyterian Church. We live in Bangalore. And I think 5 years ago, we were just the two of us, and God brought a darling into our lives. Today, he's 13 years old. His name is Abi. We call him Abi. A little bit about what I do and how God started this journey. So, I'm also a certified biblical counselor. I work a lot with trauma and abuse victims, especially also adoption trauma is an area of expertise for me. Then I work with a lot of adoptive parents in that area. But all that would not have started unless the Lord actually closed several doors for us. So I should say our adoption journey began almost 13 years ago, about the same age as my son, because that's when we got married, my husband and I. And we've always wanted to have a house full of children. And I always believed in the proverb that says, where there are no oxen, the manger is clean, right? But in the production of much oxen, there's plenty, right? So I always thought my house should be a messy home with a lot of kids running around, and there's no shame in that. Um, and I left my job as a marketing and a consultant, business consultant in the year 2011, basically to set up my home. I started to read up on the home, started to furnish my home, started to take care of everything with the hope of having children, making the home prepared for children. And within a year, we lost our first child in the womb, and after another year we lost another child in the womb, and after that we waited on that journey to have children, and we thought God was really wanting us to have many children, but nothing seemed to be happening. During which time we were in the US for a while, and my husband and I were preparing for pastoral studies to come back to India. And so when we came back in 2016, I decided that I was not going to be a mother anymore, because God had closed the womb, and that was his jurisdiction. He decides what he wants to do. And so I said, no, that's about it. That's the end of that chapter. And so let's just maybe help other parents. And I was a big homeschool buff, so I used to kind of walk with other women in homeschooling and things like that. So, but my husband would not want to go that route. He would say, no, if I have to learn to be a good pastor, I need to learn to be a good father. There's no two ways about it. I need to learn how to parent, take care and disciple a child. And so he said, let's knock on the adoption door. And I was probably one of the most reluctant candidates on that list. I did not want to adopt. I said, I have no maternal instincts. God didn't give me warm, fuzzy feelings about children that were not my own. So I said, it's not going to happen. And so we were like, what do we do about it? So we decided to go ahead and apply, and said, okay, I'm just going to obey my husband and do what he's saying. And so got on the list. But as we were on the list, we were on what's called as a normal wait list, right? And we took the path of least resistance, just 0 to 2 years old children, anywhere from India, and just waited and waited. And as most of you know, the wait list is probably 3 years long from the time you apply. And we didn't know it at that time. And as we waited, the researcher that I am, there's always a list of children that's available for you to gaze at, and that's called the special needs category. There's another one called immediate placement, which is basically children who've gone in and out of homes, or maybe sibling adoptions and so on and so forth. So I started researching and browsing the story of all these children, and I should say they're all stories. They're all one line stories, because in one line in one row, you not only see the photo of a child, you see his or her disability, and then you get to see their reports. And every day I would spend time actually reading a story of this child. And as I started doing that, something incredible started happening. I realized that these children had profound, some of them profound disabilities, and some of them it's things like delayed milestones, and I got to know things like intersex, children born with different genitalia and so on and so forth. It's like, is there even a problem like that? And I didn't even know about it. And as I was going through that list, I think my bowels of compassion were already opening up for these children. I'd already worked with special needs children when I was in the US, and I've always had, a liking to work with them. But as I went through that list, I could see one common story for all these kids. Nobody wanted them, including their homes. How do I know that? Because in their reports, there would be hardly any details given on their disability. There'll be one word saying dumb. This child is dumb. This child has problems I have no idea about. And most of their heads were shorn, and they looked very malnourished, and they would have this really bleak, dark face about them. And it's only later on I came to know that there's a sort of a ghetto mentality about many, many institutions in India, where all they want to do with these children is stuff them and shove them out somewhere and just, get money to get by. A lot of them lived, wore the same clothes, shared the same clothes, lived on a mat. Some of them weren't cared for. Feeding bottles were stuffed in, not cared for. And so all of these started to become a pattern of what was going on with special needs children. But somewhere along that line, within the first 10 or 15, I saw a spunky little kid who just looked completely like an anomaly there, because he had a lot of hair, and he just burst forth in this beaming smile. And I was just folding his hands, just like, come and check me out kind of a look. And I was like, what are you doing here? You look pretty sweet. You look adoptable. Why are you on this list? And as I just went into his story, I realized the nightmare that he was in. He just had this huge list of disabilities, words that I look back and I realized I had no idea what they even meant. I could barely even spell them out. So there was a list about 5 or 6 disabilities attached to his name. And then I looked at his social record, I looked at his medical record. And socially, the child was just the sweetest boy who just wanted to live and thrive. But medically, he was a goner case. I mean, there was really nothing you can do about it. And then I looked at him and I said, "Boy, now I know why you can't go to any home. There's just nobody would come and take you." And then I started to gasp in my heart, saying, "Who's going to come for you, little child?" And right then, as though it was like a movie that was just reeling out, the Lord knocked on the door of my heart, said, "You're going to get this child." At first, I was just flabbergasted. I mean, I was like, what's going on? I mean, I couldn't fathom the emotions I was going through. But then, as weeks were rolled into months, and as I started to pray and talk to my husband and talk to friends, I just couldn't contain the fountain that was already opened up in me. And God answered that prayer, because I said, "Lord, unless you open my fountain in my heart, my bowels of compassion, I'm not going to adopt a child. And the child you open that up for is the child I'm going to bring home." And that's how, we brought our little Abhi home. Of course, between that and the time when we got home was a huge, many leaps and bounds that we had to jump. But probably tell it another time. But that's a little bit into how God put our son into my heart and how we began our adoption journey.
Thank you so much, Sarmishta, for sharing your story. We would love to hear more about it and about our bee at a later time when we have more time for sure. But thank you so much. Sarah, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Sarah, and I'm actually a lawyer. So I'm very excited to be here to share my story. So, yeah, thank you very much for this privilege. So, yeah, my family, we would go to Calcutta and we would pass this orphanage run by Mother Teresa and the nuns. And I would ask when I was quite young, actually, like, what's an orphanage? And the response I got was, it's a place for children who don't have anyone to care for them. And I would think, but why are there children who no one will care for? Then I would hear, no, they are being cared for, but somehow it just didn't seem to make any sense to me that there were children who were in so much need and there was no home for them, no home with parents, siblings, uncles, aunts, just a church family. So I was quite young when that happened. Um, Growing up, I do remember interacting with children who had been adopted in my family's church network. Someone who mentored me had adopted a little baby girl. Then there was a couple at church that I attended who had adopted a baby boy. I was quite young, but I think I can still recall just the joy on every parent's faces. I remember growing up and reading about Pandita Ramabai and Mukti Mission in Kedgaon on the outskirts of Pune. And I think all of this really impressed something on my heart. But it seemed very unfair to me, especially because I'm a lawyer, that in India, Christians were only permitted to be guardians and not adopt. So when the law changed in 2015, so now there's a state law, and that permitted people who just met some basic criteria to adopt, regardless of religion, regardless of whether they are married, single. I was like, okay, here's my chance. I'm just going to do it. But I think I really didn't have the courage. In 2020, I actually even helped a family at our church who were adopting, just helped them walk through some of the paperwork, helped them in court, walked alongside them, brought home their baby girl with them. Yeah, in many ways, I think I would consider her my first child. But it wasn't, I think, actually until 2021, just a year ago, just until the second wave of COVID had hit India, just seeing the sheer toll that it took on human life, the devastating impact it had on families, that I actually registered on the website. I mean, I would receive messages from time to time, read news reports on just generations being wiped out, children orphaned, abandoned, orphanages and shelters running out of food. I felt like I just couldn't sit there any longer. I had to do something. So something more than just make a financial contribution or volunteer at an orphanage. They're all very good things, but I just really felt like I had to do something a little more. So I registered on Kara, and then came the long wait, just like even Sarmishta spoke of, right? When you're waiting, it feels like forever. Just to keep sane, I think I would read some books, pieces written by adopted parents, children, hear stories, pray. I don't think I could ever have imagined or even hoped that things would move so quickly for me. So by December 21, just about a year ago, I was holding my little baby girl in my arms. So yeah, I would say that my story is quite incomplete if I didn't mention the invaluable support I have received from family, church, family, co workers, all the encouragement, advice from very grounded, godly people. They've been a part of this story. And yeah, they have helped in uh, just praying very practical ways. My church even organized a prayer shower before I left to pick up my baby girl. Yeah, I might also add that I've had one incident where because I'm single, I'm used to going to church alone and returning alone. And after adopting her, this was a couple of months ago, I actually reached the gate and I suddenly remembered, I think I'm missing someone. So I had actually left my baby girl. And so, yeah, sometimes I have to remember that this has actually happened. So there have been moments, but overall, it's been a very beautiful journey.
Wow, thank you so much, Sarah. That has happened to like people with multiple kids. So let's not talk about that. But thank you so much for sharing your story and congratulations on your new baby girl. We're very happy for you. What about you, Carissa? Would you tell us a little bit about your story?
Yeah, so my name is Karisa, and I have been married to my husband Arvind for 13 years now, which is coincidentally also the same amount of time that I've been living here in India this month, actually. 13 years in India. So I have 4 children. They're age 11, 8, 6, and 3. So as you can imagine, my main role in life is mother and stay-at-home mother with my 4 children. But my husband is also a pastor, and we love being involved in our local church. And I especially love teaching the little ones in Sunday school ministry. And I also work for a Canadian adoption agency that actually mainly serves NRIs living in Canada who are adopting from back here in India. So my story of adoption actually began long time before I became a mother. So when I was in 4th class, my family adopted my middle brother. So he was about 2nd grade. He was special needs. He was from Romania. And as you can imagine, that really significantly shaped my life. After we adopted him, my family continued to be actively involved in his orphanage in Romania. And so I spent some pretty significant time in my high school years and my college years going back and working in his orphanage and being a part of that. And then in college, I was part of a local church that just had a huge heart for adoption. And there was an explosion of families adopting in the church. And it was really amazing to be part of. And out of that, we formed a ministry that sought to basically wrap around families, was the term that we used, that were thinking about adopting, or this was in the US, so fostering also. And so I got to be part of that, kind of, as a single college person at the time, being one who wasn't in a position to adopt, but could come alongside families and help raise awareness and things like that. So, adoption and orphan care was a significant part of my family and my life pretty early on, and really played a very significant role in my spiritual growth. So before Arvin and I even married, adoption was a topic that we discussed, and thankfully we both wanted it to be part of growing our family. But for a number of reasons, it wasn't until the day of our 10th wedding anniversary that we applied to Cara. And so we had our 3 biological children already in the home, and they were also quite excited to adopt. My oldest daughter was very thankful that there would be no doubt that it was a sister this time. She had cried with both of her brothers, so she was quite thankful that adoption meant that she got to have a sister. So yeah, we applied August 2019. We were in the special needs stream. We had always really wanted to adopt a child with special needs, I think because I had worked with special needs children in high school and college, and then my brother's own story. That was really important to me. And so our wait was shorter than most. We found our daughter on the list in 2020, kind of right as all the COVID restrictions were starting. And to be honest, it didn't look like we were going to get to bring her home anytime soon. But God really worked a lot of miracles. The day we showed up at her orphanage, they said, "Oh, you really came." We're like, "Yes, we really came, all of us." So we were so thankful and happy. And she was a little over 1 year old when she joined us. She's 3 now. She's amazing. She's resilient. She's very goofy and fun. And she has just been such a joy to add into our family. I think that the first year, because of her special needs, was pretty challenging. She underwent a major surgery within the first few months of being with us. But we really saw God's hand in the timing of her adoption, because COVID meant that all 6 of us were stuck in the house together 24/7. And yet that was such a beautiful blessing and enabled her to bond really well with all her siblings and with us. So yeah, it's been a journey, but it's been a joy.
Wow. Thank you so much, Karisa. I feel really privileged to hear these stories and just talking to you guys today. It's such a joy. I mean, I can just see like from the way that you guys are talking about your children, like how much they are valued and loved, and that's what every child deserves. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Over to you, Shobi.
Yeah, I echo what Sue said, and thanks so much. It's encouraging and challenging to hear. And we just want to ask you a couple of questions. So I'll start with Sarmishta. Sarmishta, you had written a post for IndiaAnya a few years back titled "The Gospel is Not Paralyzed." And I'm reading an excerpt from it. You say, adopting a special needs child is not only risky, but scandalous. I know many well-wishers who came to know that we were adopting. They were happy for us and rejoiced in this decision to bring a child home. But when they later came to know that we were bringing home a child who had no sensation below his torso, they were appalled. Some were scared for us. My family broke down. Those we looked up to looked down upon us in disbelief. It was too much for them to handle. And this is a normal response for a lot of us when it comes to adopting a child with a disability. And would you please elaborate on how God prepared you and equipped you, And also, what are some of the ways in which adoptive parents can prepare to welcome a child with a disability or special needs?
Yeah, I think it's been 5 years since that happened. And I must say this on the record: the several of them who were looking down in disbelief actually now look up. They look up to my son and they say, "Boy, I have really learned much of life from you." And I don't think that would have been possible had not the Lord been part of that whole narrative and story. And I think the first thing I would say is there aren't a lot of us. And that itself is the sheer tragedy of it. And that also makes one feel extremely lonely and scared in the journey. So that's what we felt. We felt very lonely, very misunderstood, and very scared. There are times, I'm a planner, so I like to have foresight, when I'm kind of planning something. But this is one case where I had no zilch foresight. I couldn't see ahead as to why God was going to do this and what He was going to do with this child or with us. But the one thing that really helped us to keep in good stead throughout the journey of between the time of seeing my son's photograph to bringing him into foster care and adopting him further on, and then the last 5 years or so. One of the things that the Lord brought when we were still pondering whether this is the child for us and whether we would be able to handle it as a pastor's family was Psalm 68. And as the tradition goes for us in our church and in our family, we sing through the entire book of Psalms. And so this is like the back of my hand. And when we were singing this, it came in a very fresh way to me. Basically, when we sing that psalm, it goes on like this. It says, God makes a home, a family for the lonely. And when I heard this, and I heard by that time we had gathered enough information about my son, and we knew he wanted to go home to a Christian family. And then it was like the Lord just saying it again, I'm here wanting this child to go to a home. He's lonely. Is your home open? And that was the answer. And we were like, Lord, you are already taking care of this child. I think really what equipped us throughout the journey, even now, is to know that God is the father to the fatherless, as Psalm 68 says. And it says he sets the solitary in a home. He sets the lonely in a family. That is God's heart for these children. And he cares for them. He is a father to them. That's what the scripture says. And just to kind of step back from my own life and just look at that picture, God is a father to these children. What is he really wanting me to do? He's wanting me to come alongside him in his parenting of these children. What he's not asking is that I take this on as my burden. He's just saying, come and see what I'm doing with these kids. I want you to have the double blessing of seeing how I'm blessing these children and how I'm parenting them. And so when I said yes, and when we were walking, all through these years, one of the ways we've really been strengthened is to constantly tell the Lord, we don't know how to do this. We don't know how to parent. Just be honest about it. And say, Lord, but you've been parenting this child. 8 years before we even knew him, you parenting this child. Show us, Lord, how you're parenting him. Teach us. And so that is really what carried us through in terms of equipping us, equipping us in parenting. In terms of other children, and what you can be doing if you're wanting to bring a special needs child home. I think the first thing to remember is God's heart for these children, that he wants to set them in a family. That's his heart. And if you're convinced of that, and if the Lord is already knocking on the door of your heart, then the next thing you should do is study the needs that this child has. If there's a particular child you're looking at, or a particular, profile of a disability that you want to adopt, study as much as you can about that disability. Talk to the caregivers. One of the things I found helpful, and I went out of the Kara system to do this when I just got permission, is to speak directly to the caregivers. And that really helped me, because when I spoke to them and when we went and saw how they were taking care of this child, we felt we were okay in a comfortable zone. Like we knew what they were doing. We didn't feel as scared or lonely because somebody was already caring for this child. And so we knew that we had to learn from them. So sometimes the first primary caregivers can be great examples for us to learn from. Sometimes we learn from their mistakes. Sometimes if they are very good caregivers, like the one my son had, I would just lap it up, and I learned everything I could from them. And be ready to be challenged. One of the things I continue to see, and which will also be a prospect for anyone trying to adopt a special needs child, is you're going to clear the forest for your child. You like it or not, in India, if you're adopting a special needs child, you are going with a machete and you're clearing the forest. And I always tell people this illustration. I'm going with a machete. I'm clearing the forest for my son, whether by my voicing out, my writing, my going and knocking on different, insurance doors and so on and so forth. But as I'm clearing the forest, I'm preparing a way so my son can wheel himself in, because my son is on wheels all the time. So partly what parents have to do is become champions for that child. You need to have your machete in your hand. Don't be offended. Know that people are going to cast some stones at you, and just be ready to knock on a lot of doors. But have the machete ready, clear the forest, so this child can then walk in, wheel in, set himself in to the world that God has made for him to thrive in. It's really God's world, and God has a place for this child. You just have to figure out where that place is.
Wow. Yeah, thank you, Sarmishta. And that's a powerful image, like going through a forest with him shedding. So that's going to stick to our heads. Thank you for that. And like you said, there's no two way about it. God really wants to put these children in homes. So yeah, thank you for speaking into that. My question is to you, Sarah. The only person we knew of who had adopted as a single person was Sushmita Sen all those years ago. I remember it being like big news in newspapers and magazines at the time. And that was in the year 2000. 22 years have passed, yet it is still news when a single person adopts. What were the struggles or challenges that you faced in making the decision to adopt as a single person?
Yeah, I think that was certainly big news. Yeah. Um, but I do remember in 2018, there was a single dad in Maharashtra who was then said to be the youngest single adoptive parent in India who had adopted a child with special needs. He had adopted in 2016, but his story was only told or came to light in 2018. So I'm sure there are many, many stories of lesser known people out there, and we need more of them. We really need to celebrate their stories. Yeah, some things I used to think a lot about, and I probably still do. Just as a single person, I often think, was it really right from a biblical perspective for singles to adopt? I mean, children do need both parents, and that used to weigh quite heavily on me and probably still does. The other thing was, I did not find that many resources out there that would give good advice for singles adopting. I used to often question, am I adopting because I have given up on marriage? Is this child my savior? Is the adoption about myself? Or is it really about the child? I would often ask myself that, would the child I adopt miss having a father? How would such a child respond when asked at the park or at school, who is your dad? I have seen dads and moms juggle work schedules, struggle to take care of, and at the same time struggle to take care of young ones. And I would really wonder, how am I really going to do this? Um, yeah, I have a full-time job. I was 41 when I adopted, so I used to often ask myself, do I really have the energy? How is this going to work? I would also think that if I, you know, not if, but rather when I pass away with COVID or whatever else, who is going to step in to take care of my child? Yeah, I also imagine my child growing up someday and asking me, I did not choose this life for myself, a life without a father. And why did you do this to me? Yeah, I would say that there are no easy answers, no bad answers. But I ask myself, even as I thought through all these questions, um, these are gray areas. There's the future is uncertain. How am I going to respond? There's a place, I think, just to lay down all these questions and fears before the Lord and just pray and just take the plunge. And I think that's what I did.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I know, I mean, you all know singleness is a big passion for me, and I'm so glad to have your story as part of this podcast. And yeah, thinking through just the biblical perspective, Carissa, this question is for you. Would you say that there is a biblical mandate for Christians to be involved in adoption? And how can the church come alongside a family who has adopted?
Yeah, Shobana. So when you first gave this question, I really kind of went back and forth in my mind the best way to answer it. I think my short answer, to be honest, is no, I don't think there's a biblical mandate to adopt specifically. But let me explain what I mean by that. I think if you understand a mandate to be an official command to do something that is applicable to all Christians, I don't think you find in Scripture a mandate to adopt. But that said, I think there's a really clear call and mandate on believers to have a heart toward the vulnerable and to reflect God's heart for the vulnerable. And I think adoption is a very practical and precious way that God has given us to work out that mandate that he's given us to care for the vulnerable. So I think that, sometimes adoption can be elevated a little bit. I saw this, in my perspective as a child with adoption and seeing the adoption movement in the US. I think that sometimes adoption can be elevated, and I think we shouldn't over elevate it. I think we should recognize that the mandate to care for the vulnerable can look different for different people, how God has gifted you, what resources he's given you, where he's placed you. I think some people are called to care for families so that their children don't become orphans, right? I think that's a really important part of the mandate to care for the vulnerable. So I'm saying no, but I'm not denying that, I think adoption is definitely should be something that the church cares really deeply about, and should be something that we're talking about as believers, because I think, as Sarmishta said earlier, it is something that God very clearly wants to care. He cares for orphans. He wants them set in families. I liked how she said it, that he's parenting them and calling us alongside to help. So I think we should always be challenging ourselves and families in our church to think about whether adoption is a way that God is calling us to radically obey him and, basically show his heart towards others. I think it's a really beautiful act of obedience to God, and definitely something the church should promote and encourage. So I was thinking about some ways that the church could do that. And I think, for church leaders and pastors or, women's ministry leaders, I think it's really important that we take every opportunity we have to talk about adoption, to talk about orphan care. I think we shouldn't ignore it, and we should educate ourselves about the needs around us. We should educate ourselves about what's happening in the adoption world. I think that we have a responsibility to know who are the vulnerable around us that God has placed around us, and how can we care for them. I think another thing that churches can do to really support adoption and adoptive families is to not simply support them, but celebrate them. I think that when adoption is brought up, it's often, there's some concern, there's some criticism, there's some curiosity as well, but there's very rarely true just celebration. And I think that if we step back and we really understand that this is showing God's heart, that we will rejoice and we will celebrate when we see children set into families and we see the vulnerable cared for. And so I think any ways that we can shower with prayer, or we can just cheer, just be actually really excited that someone is choosing to adopt. I think that just goes a really long way to the church being a place that is promoting adoption and accepting adopted children with no reservations, and really seeing it as a wise choice. I think that if we can really see adoption as a really wise and important way that we as believers can show God's heart towards these children, I think that can radically change how we approach adoption. And I think we really have to move out of the category of, okay, you couldn't have kids on your own, so you had to adopt, and kind of making it about the families needing children. We need to move it more to a discussion of children need families, and God has called us to care for them. So how can we, how can our church help bring these children into families and be part of that? So yeah, that's kind of a longer answer for no, I don't think it's a biblical mandate. But yes, it should be extremely important and close to our hearts. And I hope that every believer has compassion for orphans and is actively seeking to see how they can celebrate and support and encourage adoption.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much, Carissa. That makes a lot of sense. And I love how you talked about like how you differentiated encouragement and celebration. And yes, these children and the families do deserve to be celebrated, and especially in God's family, as like, we've been adopted into God's family, and for us to have that privilege in our church families and to just celebrate these children, it truly is a privilege. So yeah, thank you so much for that. Sarmishta, if I can ask you this question. In a recent news article in the Economic Times, it mentions that while Indians are opening up to adoption, they remain averse to adopting children with special needs. Fewer than 50 children with special needs were adopted in the last 3 years. That number is staggering for a nation of 1 billion people. What fears keep Christians from looking at special needs kids as their future children? And how can the church stem this and encourage the adoption of special needs children? Would you please speak into that?
Yeah, in my own encounter with prospective adoptive parents, and this is my own personal experience in the church, they all hear my story and then they say, we want to adopt. And then they would add this quote, but I want them normal, right? I think there is a big, I would say, perspective difference on what really categorizes as normal. There is nothing normal in this world. I wish Christians would just loudly shout it out of their rooftop. There's nothing normal in this world. The only thing normal about this world was Jesus. Everything else is absolutely abnormal. And there's a way in which that scar still remains when we see kids with special needs, not being adopted. And I think if Christians, and I wrote about this once, I said that the day when Christians bring these special needs kids and round them around their table and bring all kinds of all shapes and sizes of people into their table, then we can hang up a sign around outside our doorpost and say, welcome to the normal. Because we are not normal. And so I think the first thing that I feel in a society like India, the reason why Christian parents are also a little averse to adopting special needs children is, I often say, in the U.S. and European countries, right? It's a free country. Your mindset is, what can I do with the resources God is giving me? But in India especially, it's a slave mindset. There's a lot of fear that drives our society forward. We don't like it in a particular direction, but that's how we are driven. And so subconsciously, that's part of even the Christian psyche. We say, what is the future going to look like with a child with special needs in the mix? Right? You want to know answers to questions that God would rather not answer for you. Because like, Sarah said, you take the plunge, right? I mean, how many questions can you get answered to actually check off and say, Lord, this is the right kid for me. I put the fleece now and let me bring this child. No, God is not going to answer those kinds of questions. He's going to just say, do you trust me with this? Are you willing to do it? So at some point, Christian parents have to honestly ask, what am I afraid of here? Right? Because there is a lot of fear that drives these kinds of decisions. The other thing I think, which is very predominant, particularly in our society, is children are often seen as the crown of their heads, parents' heads, right? We wear them as prized possessions, really they are, because we want to say, oh, my son has finished this degree, my son is now a doctor, this, blah, 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 I mean, I've come from a generation of chartered accountants and, doctors and engineers and so on and so forth. And so, I understand the problem which is there collectively in our society, in that children have to become a crown for their head, where special needs kids don't fit into that category, right? Some people think they're more like sandals for my feet. What do I do with them? I can't do much with them, right? And they see them as a burden. And the other thing, aspect of parents is that Children are a return on investment. I put into them, I train them, and then when I'm 50, I hope I will get back my return, right? I think Christian parents probably fall into the same trap. Okay, they see children as a crown for their heads. They start to compare these children in schools and churches and so on and so forth. And so they don't know how to categorize children who are disabled or have special needs. They just don't fit into that category block. And if you're going to see children as a return on investment, I think there is some unbiblical idea about that, because children are the investment. Children are the return, right? There is no return coming from the children. Children are a heritage from the Lord. That means they are the prized possession that God is bestowing on you. And if we can't see that perspective, I don't think we're going to get anywhere with seeing these children adopted. And so I think that perspective has to change. We have to change our understanding of what really is normal. We have to change our understanding of what children are. They're not a crown for our heads. They're not our possessions, and they're not a return on investment. They are God's investment. They have to be stewarded, cared for, as long as they're here. And then when the time is done, we give them up to the Lord, and be able to say with Job, Lord, I come naked, I go naked. Lord, you be blessed. If you decide to take my children, when their time's up, I'll still praise you. We can't think those things. We always think that our children will outlive us. So those kinds of things pull us back from actually putting our hands to the plow of special needs adoption. The other thing which I think is a real challenge I want to leave for the church is, we keep putting these banners up saying, abortion is evil, and I know in the States this is very common, right? Abortion is evil, and, you want to stop abortion, you want to protect children, children are valuable. The question I have is, okay, we stop abortion. What about all the kids that are thrown out because nobody wants them? What about all the kids which have disabilities? Is the church willing to go and pick these children up? Do they still value them? Are we only concerned about the children dying in the womb? What about the children after they come out of the womb, right? So I think all of these are, like Karisa beautifully differentiated. There's no command from the Bible that we should all be doing this, but there's a general aura in the scriptures that projects God's heart for these kinds of issues. And we need to have the same heartbeat like our Father in heaven. And that's when we will catch the picture, gain perspective, and be able to, gain momentum in some of these areas. Otherwise, yeah, we will always be asking for the normal and the wrong questions. Yeah. So
Thanks so much, Sarmishta, for speaking into these blind spots and the things that we tend to see with our own eyes. And yeah, I just pray that this would help people to lift up their eyes to see God's heart. And yeah, I loved what you said. No one is normal. Thanks for that. Sarah, you've been through the whole process with Kara recently, and you've been a great help to many of my friends who have started the process or have been thinking about it. So, if someone is thinking of adoption, what are the things to keep in mind, especially regarding the process in India through Kara?
So there are a lot of specific things to do which will certainly help the process go a lot smoother. But I think we won't go into that today. I have actually received a lot of help, including from Karisa. So yeah, I am indebted to everybody who came alongside me. Yeah, to those listening who are considering adoption, just know that the process involves navigating some complex regulations. You have to deal with government authorities, there are court systems, there's Kara, and this can all feel very overwhelming, and you just feel like, I don't think I can do this. But I think if we just stay focused that at the end of this is a little person who needs a home, um, then you will just do everything that is required to bring that child home. So it's just a process, it's papers. Yeah, two things that I would think would help, and I hope that they help, is even like suggested a little while ago, that just have a mentality that is that you're in for battle. So this battle mentality, I think, will help. We are all in uncharted territory. There's no point going in assuming that it will be an easy ride. There are many hurdles, lots of not so nice surprises, but we can pray, and the Lord has promised that He will give wisdom. So we will overcome this. The second thing I would say is that, and it's not easy for most of us, is ask the Lord for lots and lots of patience. We will need it. There is a long wait. There has been a change in regulations, procedure. So it's good to register early. I think a lot of people are sitting on the fence, and including me. But it's just good to register early and just trust that the Lord will lead, um, will help you meet the right people. You will get through all of this paperwork and procedures and court processes and all of that. Yeah, many things, including the documentation. I mean, it's supposed to be a checklist, but it's not clear. The regulations can change even while you're waiting. The process can all feel like, I really can't do this. It's too overwhelming. And while things change and while you're battling all of this, just it can feel very discouraging. But just know that the Lord is sovereign, and through all of these changes, yeah, He is with you. You're not alone. You just keep reminding yourself, as I'm sure everyone did, that yeah, it's my child at the end of this. I will go through all of this process. I will do whatever is needed, everything that I need to, just to bring them home. Yeah, and with God's help, I will.
Wow. Thank you, Sarah. That's really helpful. And Carissa, if I may ask you, what are some things to consider for parents who already have children when thinking of adoption? And how has that equation been for your family to have an adoptive sibling? We already heard what your daughter thinks, but how has it been altogether?
Yeah. Yeah. So when we brought our daughter home, my older children were 9, 6, and 4. It was funny tonight, just before I headed into this, my 11-year-old and my 6-year-old were standing there, and I said, "What would you say to another child if, their parents were considering adopting?" And my daughter said, "It's really hard, but it's really worth it." And my son, who's 6, said, "Be strong, be brave, most of all, be kind to your sister." And I thought, yeah, that pretty much sums it up. But yeah, I mean, for our children, because adoption was something that my husband and I wanted, we talked about it with them from the beginning. And I think if you have children in your home and you want to think about adoption, you should just begin talking with them. I think it's really important to normalize adoption. That means finding other families who've adopted. And we thankfully had a lot of family and friends who had adopted. So my kids got to see that in action. I made sure to add lots of children's books to our library that talked about adoption. So it was something that we talked about, something that we dreamed about with our kids, prayed about. And so I think you have to kind of begin there. It's a normal way to add to your family. And I think kids have to be part of that discussion. And that is one thing I would say is you have to talk with your kids. Don't be afraid of your children's questions. They'll have lots of them. My kids have had lots and lots of questions through the whole process. Namely, at one point, why does this take so long? But they have questions, and I think that it's always important to pay attention to your children's questions. Don't dismiss them. Try to get at the heart of their concerns, especially if they have them. What are their concerns? What's going on in their heart that's making them feel this way? How can you talk with them? We made sure to involve our children as much as possible in age-appropriate ways in all the different milestones. We were really careful not to put any of the, I would say, burden of adoption on them. So for example, when we were looking at the special needs list, which is a really weighty list to look at, we never exposed our children to that list. We found our daughter and then we, showed her to them. And so there were certain things that we didn't involve them in because we felt they were too young and it would have put a burden on them. But in other areas, in as many milestones as we could, we had them praying alongside with us and talking about it and things like that. I think we should never forget that our children are also able to be worked on by the Holy Spirit, right? They have a relationship with the Lord. And so we shouldn't discount their ability to understand the heart of God towards adoption. And I think we can really use it as a way to grow their faith as well as ours, My kids, again, probably because of COVID, we had 2 years of pretty much 24/7 together, which was actually great for bonding and cocooning. And we were really thankful for it. But one thing my husband and I have done is just make sure that we're talking with all of our kids one-on-one and giving them a chance to talk about their challenges and their concerns, especially with our older ones. There were some hard and heavy things when our daughter joined our family, and things that were clearly coming out of her trauma. And so to spend time with them and talk through those things has been really important for our family, and to just honor them, as being part of our family. When you asked this question, one other kind of non-related area that came to mind was just our language in talking about adoption. And I think one thing we have tried to do in our family is be very careful about our language and let our kids lovingly see us correct people when they're talking about our family. And I think that how we talk about adoption and how we model it will impact how our kids feel about the adoption, how they talk about the adoption. So like, just for example, we've had someone who pretty regularly would talk about, Karisa and Arvin have 3 children and they have an adopted one. And so to be able to say, we actually have 4 children. We have 4 children. 3 are biological and 1 was adopted, but she was adopted. Done. She's now our child. And I had that conversation with my daughter standing there. And I think that's really important for the children, all the children, to see there's no difference in our place in the family, So that's kind of tangential, but I think how your children feel about the adoption will be pretty much mirrored by how you talk about it, how you respond to it. And so we have to think through these things and sometimes talk about it with our children, so that they also have the words to respond when people ask questions.
Thanks so much, Karisa. That's really helpful. And I think the language part is helpful even to talk in church about adoption. So thanks for that. This is a question for anyone to answer. It's open, and it'll be really great to have you weigh in on this. In India, there is a lot of stigma on adoption, and so many parents don't tell their children that they are adopted. And what are your thoughts on this? And what are some ways you plan to process this with your child?
I would love to answer this because I feel really strongly about this. I believe that we should never lie to our child. And underlying that, I think, is just the biblical fact that God is not a God who lies, and he commands his people to not lie. So I do feel very strongly that, and this is in all of parenting, children, our communication with our children is not exempt from that. We should reflect God. We should not lie to our children. And so I think it's really important, just from a biblical standpoint, that that's not how we're approaching our parenting. But I think also on a practical level, inevitably your child is going to probably find out that they're adopted at some point. And I think that if they have been lied to, the feelings of betrayal and deep hurt, and really it will become an additional trauma that they have to go through because their parents chose to lie to them. I just can't imagine the wounds that would leave on a child to suddenly know, wait, my whole life has been a lie. And so if you think in the long term, in short term, it might, deal with some of the uncomfortable conversations, but in the long term, the hurt to the child, I think there's just no reason to do it. But also I think that it's important that we remember that understanding their origin and their identity is their right. They have a right to know this information. And I think the idea that you can live with an adopted child and not share with them that they're adopted comes from a place of believing that adoption, especially if they're adopted at birth, has no impact on them. And that's just simply not the case. Adoption does have an impact on them. And I think others here would be better able to speak to this, but it is a trauma. And so I think that hiding that from them won't make their questions or struggles that will come up later in life go away. It will just make it more confusing, more hidden, more difficult. And so I think that it's really important that we honor the fact that this is the story that God has given them and bring it into the light. Plus, there's the fact that, hiding it just perpetuates the stigma and the shame around adoption. So when a child finds out that they've been adopted, if they've been lied to, they're going to feel there was shame there. That's why it was hidden. There's something about me that's broken or less deserving, or something that has to be hidden or that I should be ashamed of. And that's obviously, I don't think any adoptive parent wants to do that to their child, but that is what they're communicating. If they give into the stigma and hide it, they're basically communicating to the child, I agree with the stigma. That's why I didn't want to say anything, and that's why I didn't want you exposed to it. So I think it's really, really important that we talk to our children early and often. Of course, it will look different when they're 2 than when they're 12, than when they're 18. So I think it should be very child-led. As they ask questions, as they are curious, we should respond in age-appropriate ways. There's a lot of resources online, and I'm sure counselors to also give you some ideas of how to talk about it with your child. But and I've used this language before, but we just need to normalize it for them. It is part of their story. And I think that, when we're telling them our story, we can always affirm our love for them, talk about how thankful we are. But I think we should also be really careful to not go the other direction and invent a story for them. I think we should just be very careful to make sure to point them to their savior. I'm not their savior as a parent. I don't need to invent a story to make them love me more, or I don't need to villainize their birth parents in any way. I don't need to make up a story. I need to tell them the truth that I know. I need to admit things that I don't know, and just have open communication with them as much as possible. And I think seek out counselors, seek out people who are trained in trauma, in adoption trauma, who can walk through it with you. I think that it's important to seek out resources and help and advice to talk well about it in your family, but always, always talk about it. Be thankful for it, celebrate it. I think that's really important. But, above all, we have to entrust our child to the Lord. And whatever culture is going to say, whatever our families are going to say, whatever we also are afraid of, they're under his sovereign care. And he loves them far more than we ever could or we ever understand. And so through all of its trauma and joys and ups and downs, we just have to entrust our children and their stories to the Lord. And I think not worry about what the world says, but instead point them to him.
Yeah, I think Karisa has probably covered all ground on this question. I was just I wasn't planning to answer this question, but I think I just want to stress on the fact that anyone who tries to not talk about the history of this child who's being adopted is again operating from a place of fear, right? There's a lot of fear that's going on. You already have you've colored the story in a very negative light. You see the damage of the past. You see that there is a damaged past, and you have believed the lie that the present and the future is as bleak as that. You don't think there's any redemption in the story. And I think that's usually the case where people try to hide, like what Adam did, right? When he knew something was wrong, he hid, right? And then he lied. And then there was shame. So all of that, I think when we start to color that story of that child that way, the child doesn't think there's going to be any better version of the story. If my parents, whom I trust, have such a bad version of it, why would I think there's going to be anything better to the story? But if you operate from a place of faith instead of fear, saying, Lord, you brought this child into this world, you are the one writing the story. Help me to say whatever I know of the story and let this child discover the remainder of the story. It's his story, her story, right? And to know that even though there are shards of broken pieces in that story, the Lord knows how to put that piece together. He knows how to piece that story back together in a way that both brings glory to Him and honor to this child. And so I think we need to recast our thinking around that as well. Sure, there's a lot of things that we have to confront in life. And let's face that. Let's confront this and let's let our children know that this is where they come from and this is what it looks like. And sure, there's some people who say, this is my tummy daughter and this is my heart daughter. Okay, use safe language, that's possible. But in a way that the child knows that they come from a different place, a different hospital, and, but still your child, now part of your story. So I think that's another thing just to add to what Karisa so wonderfully put. She's really covered a spectrum of issues that can come with not opening up about the story. So
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to add to what Karisa and Sarmishta have said that, as Indians, we should really be redirecting our stigma, and we should turn it towards all the prejudices based on caste, class, social, economic backgrounds that we have, skin color, killing baby girls, domestic violence. These are very worthy causes for stigma, and not some child who is adopted or some individual or family who has adopted. When I think about how will I tell my child, that is something I think about, I pray about, yeah, often, if not daily. I have spoken with families who have adopted children, and they have been very open, just like Karisa said, just normalized it. One sweet way I thought that they had done it was they had watched movies with an adoption theme. I think these are animals, and just spoken about how common it is in the animal kingdom, and that has helped the child process it. Yeah, and praise God, it has gone very well. Yeah, I don't know how the conversation with my child will go, but I do pray that they will understand that their adoption is just the way, it's just about how they entered our family. Their adoption, past trauma, struggles, these things do not define them. What, or maybe rather, who should be defining them is Christ.
While listening to you guys, I was just thinking of people that I've known and conversations I've had with like adopted parents, and like some of them, like they're not like trying to uh, like hide where the child is coming from, but like there's like a genuine fear, or like how they will be accepted by like other people. They want to like they want to protect the child from other people's feelings about the adoption, so there's like a genuine place from which too that this comes, that okay, I shouldn't tell anybody, like, and like why would other people have these conversations, like she knows or he knows that he's our child. So yeah, but it's not as simple like Sarah said, like we need to like break the stigma. There's no other way to like go about it. So yeah, thank you so much, and I love the passion with which all of you have answered this question. I have one more open question for you guys. There's a lot of fear and apprehension when it comes to adoption, especially in terms of not being able to love an adopted child as much as a biological child, or the challenges of dealing with past trauma and abuse. Carissa has like briefly touched on it, and we've kind of touched on it in like different answers. But would you guys be able to like focus on this and answer?
yeah, I can probably answer to this because I'm also a trauma counselor for adoptive parents. I come across these incidents very commonly. See, one of the first things to remember when you're integrating a child into a family is love does not depend on the object. That's one of the first thumb rules of Christian love. It is not dependent on the object. And I'm particularly talking to Christians here because I don't, when you talk about unbelievers, it's a completely different category there. But if you're talking about Christians trying to integrate, the fear that, oh, I can't love my child, I'm probably the walking witness of that. The Lord will help you to love this child because like I said, I don't have the maternal instincts. So if God is bringing this child home, God will give you a heart of compassion for this child because God Himself has that heart of compassion. And I think the theme that really helps us to understand this is it's what is said in 1 John, right? We love because he first loved us. There was nothing lovable in us for God to have set his love on us. His love doesn't depend on the object of love at all. Who were we? We were sinners, sinners who were fighting against him, enemies of God. And so when we look at it from that angle, from the gospel lens, um, our when we look at bringing an adoptive child and whether we'll have a differentiated love for these children, I think we should first stem that lie, saying that no, this my love does not depend on the object. Love is giving, and my love comes from the fact that God has loved me and God has loved these children. And so it sort of takes that weight of, if this kid is coming with a dark skin, fair skin, this particular language group, or whatever else is what do you say, the attribute of this child, all of that gets leveled, through the gospel lens. That's in terms of just being able to see these children the way the Lord sees them, and the hope that God will give us that affection for these children. Now, having said that caveat, it is difficult. Okay, now like Carisa's young ones are very wise in being saying it's hard, but be kind, but it's still fun. I mean, it's lovely, right? So I think there's definitely more than a grain of truth to that, because these children come with stories that have a lot of wounds, deep wounds and trauma. Their adjustment into the family is going to take more time. But that is not to say that theirs would be a very special case and that other children don't have behavioral struggles either. Every child is going to have behavioral struggles. At one point or the other, every child is going to act out on their sin nature. Every child is going to act out in his circumstances. And so we have to treat each one on a case by case basis rather than saying, this is the problem with adoptive children, therefore we shut the door. No, I think every child is going to have those kinds of issues. Having said that, when you do bring in an adoptive child, one of the things I always tell people is please get counseling within the first 6 months. The first 6 months is very, very crucial for integrating these children into your family. The first thing to look for is an attachment, a positive, healthy attachment that this child can have with the family. A lot of these children have already attachment issues. So detecting those issues, what kind of attachment issues are going on here? How do we nurture, feed this child? How do we help those limbic trauma, alarm systems to calm down? And then how do we work on overall brain development for these children? So there are biological aspects to why these kids do have behavioral issues. And so when parents are able to understand these kinds of things and get that kind of counseling that they require, it helps the entire family to do really well together. There are, in fact, also small modules that certain organizations have for the entire family. To do activities together. They have a family time where the children, the parents, everyone gets along with the child who's just come in, and they do family activities to actually build that bond. So there are ways to do that, and so it's not impossible. I myself have seen a child who came from a very troubled background. The mother has just reached out to me soon after he came home and just listed this truckload of very, very abusive behaviors. And we started working on this child's heart and his sense of trust and connection. And I thought it's going to take 6 months. It took, probably 2 months, less than 2 months, for this child to actually turn around, and she's just like blown away. She's like, can it even happen? I was like, sure, it happened with me. It'll happen with you. It'll happen with different families. But the initial first 6 months is extremely crucial. The reason I say that is that our parents, after that window of time, after the 1 year time, they've seen new habits and new things come in, especially if they're teen kids. And it becomes very, very difficult to break that mold. Once the injury is compounded, once they come in, they're going to basically say, this is exactly like the institutions I've been part of. There's no change. But now my hell has been compounded because I'm stuck here and I can't even go to another place. And so they act out. So I think get counseling, get trauma-informed counseling early. And that would definitely help, children to, especially adopted children, to adjust well in families that already have bio kids. I think that's probably it. And the other thing is, the important thing for parents is to learn to ask good questions behind the behaviors that helps you to piece together the story of this child. Sometimes we think, one of my friends, Rosaria Butterfield, she said, God never gets your address wrong. She's adopted a couple of children as well. God never gets the address wrong, right? When he sends this package to our home, our job is like, we come with all of this. The package comes with its own bells and whistles, but we also get to know a lot from the bells and whistles, the behavioral patterns. Okay, this child has had these struggles. This is probably what must have had. So you piece that story, and then your compassion and love for this child just goes on a different level. And now I want to help this child through this because I can understand what goes on behind these behaviors. There's a story, and your job is to really piece that together as much as possible as well.
I think the expert has spoken. Yeah, I mean, I would agree. You should reach out for resources, for help, especially in those first 6 months. I think it can be overwhelming. And I think sometimes because it's a choice that you made to adopt this child, bring them in your home, I think sometimes you can feel like, I shouldn't need help. I made this choice. I should have known what I was getting into. And so I think resisting that and seeking out help, reading books, reading articles, talking to other adoptive parents is really helpful. But I remember one night, soon after my daughter had come home, she is profoundly deaf. And at that time, she had no hearing whatsoever. And she was very upset one night and crying. And it just left my mind. Like, I didn't know what to do because I was used to singing to my kids and telling them over and over that I loved them. And it suddenly struck me that she couldn't hear me. My calming words were only calming me, not her. And so I felt extremely overwhelmed in that moment of, how am I going to reach this child? Now, of course, there were lots of ways, like rubbing her back and things that I needed to do to demonstrate my love to her. But I just remember feeling and crying so much, feeling like, oh no, how do I love her? How do I help her? How will she know that I love her? And just being comforted with the fact that I would not be able to save her. I will not be able to heal all her wounds, and I will not be able to make her feel perfectly loved, perfectly whole. Very practically, she could not hear me saying, I love you. And at that point, she had no communication whatsoever. So she didn't even know that I was trying to communicate that I loved her. And I just felt like the Lord was saying, you have to trust me, that I am going to demonstrate my love to her and that she's mine. And you need to learn how to show her and learn how to communicate with her and do all that hard work, but I'm going to do it. And you need to just obey and rest and keep going and keep rubbing her back and singing loudly, even though she can't hear anything. And that was really, I think that was a pretty big turning point for me in those early days of adoption, of just feeling like, I have to rely on the Lord. He's got to do it. I am not her savior. He is going to be her savior. He is her savior, and I need to rely on him. So I think with all the trauma that kids experience and all the various things that can come with adopting a child, I think we as believers just have this wonderful, amazing savior that we can lean on, and that enables us to love.
I feel like we should end there. I might just add one thing. Maybe this was not even the question, but I think for many adoptive parents, we have our own trauma. We fear rejection. It's not so much just our ability to love, but we feel like we're doing everything humanly possible. Often it's at great cost to health, finances. You're battling lack of sleep. And here's this child who is not reciprocating. I'm giving them my best, but they're just not reciprocating. And we read that as they're rejecting me. They hate me. They don't want me. They don't love me. But that's not so. Just like Sarmishta said, right? They're going through so many things. They're coming from a background that's so different to ours. Yeah, it's filled with violence, sometimes so much of substance abuse and all of that. And we just need to navigate each one of these issues. There's just one great resource. Karisa actually recommended it to me, so I'll just recommend it if it's helpful for others. Yeah, it's called The Connected Parent, and highly recommend that as a reading resource for people. It would really help understand where children are coming from, understanding their trauma, but also understanding our own.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for sharing that resource. Sarmishta, do you want to add something?
Yep. You said Connected Parent, right? Is that the book? Okay, so that was the more recent one. It's posthumously written by Dr. Karyn Purvis. The book that she actually got more fame for was the book Connected Child. It's more a heavy duty book. I mean, you just read the case studies there, you'll be crying for most of the time. But both of these excellent books, Connected Parent for the busy mother who's unable to figure out what's going on, Connected Child, if you're before you bring the child home, please read it. So yeah, recommend both.
Great. Thanks so much. And thanks so much, ladies, for accepting the invitation to share your stories and for your openness and vulnerability and just pointing us to our Savior. One of the things that we want to do with this podcast and with the blog as a whole is to create a space to talk about issues and topics that Christians should talk about and respond to. And adoption is one topic that is not talked about too much in India. And so we trust and pray that listening to your stories would be encouraging and challenging to our listeners, and especially those who are thinking and praying about adoption. And we'll be sharing links to the posts in IndiaAnya on adoption, links to the resources mentioned here in the description section. So please do read it and get in touch with us if you have any questions or if you would like to connect with any of our guests and writers. And ladies, thank you so much for your time. We are so grateful. And so till next time, goodbye.